The late afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of the Riverside Country Club in Millbrook, Virginia, casting golden light across the elegantly decorated reception hall. White roses and baby's breath adorned every table, while lights twinkled overhead like captured stars. The wedding reception for my sister Rebecca and her new husband David was everything she had dreamed of. A perfect fairy tale celebration with 200 guests, a live jazz band, and enough flowers to stock a florist shop. I stood in the entrance of the reception hall, adjusting the collar of my dress uniform. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. After 8 years of active duty, including 3 deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, the Navy dress blues still felt more natural than any civilian clothes ever would. The crisp white shirt, perfectly pressed jacket with its rows of ribbons, and gleaming shoes represented not just military tradition, but a life of service that had shaped every part of who I was. At 29, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell had seen more of the world than most people twice her age. The slight scar above her left eyebrow, barely visible unless you knew to look for it, came from shrapnel during a convoy attack outside Kandahar. The confident way she carried herself spoke of someone who had led troops through dangerous missions and made life-or-death decisions under pressure. But tonight, surrounded by familiar faces from her childhood, she felt oddly out of place. The guests were already mingling, champagne glasses in hand, sharing stories and catching up with old friends. I could see my parents across the room. Dad, in his best suit that he only wore to weddings and funerals, Mom in the blue dress she'd bought specifically for this occasion. They were deep in conversation with some of Rebecca's college friends, laughing at something someone had said. Neither of them had looked in my direction since I'd arrived. Through the crowd, I spotted my sister Rebecca, radiant in her flowing white gown, her face glowing with happiness as she posed for photos with David's extended family. David looked handsome in his black tuxedo, every bit the successful attorney that had won my parents' immediate approval when Rebecca first brought him home 2 years ago. They made the perfect couple, at least according to every conversation I'd overheard. At family gatherings since their engagement, the contrast couldn't have been starker. While Rebecca had followed the traditional path, college, graduate school, steady corporate job, perfect boyfriend leading to perfect marriage, I had chosen a different route entirely. 8 years ago, fresh out of college with a degree in international relations, I'd shocked everyone by commissioning as a Navy officer, instead of pursuing the law school acceptance letter that still sat framed in my childhood bedroom. My parents had never quite forgiven me for that decision. In their eyes, I'd thrown away a promising future for what they called playing soldier. They couldn't understand why their daughter would choose military service over a comfortable civilian career. The deployments, the long absences, the missed family gatherings and holidays, all of it seemed like unnecessary sacrifice to them. As I made my way through the reception hall, nodding politely to relatives I hadn't seen in years, I caught fragments of conversations that made my chest tighten. Aunt Linda whispered to her husband about how Sarah still hasn't figured out what she wants to do with her life. Uncle Tom mentioned to a family friend that it was about time she settled down and got a real job. These comments stung more than enemy fire ever had. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd led convoy operations through hostile territory, coordinated humanitarian aid distributions in war zones, and earned commendations for my service to the country. Yet here, among my own family, I was still seen as the daughter who had lost her way. My dress uniform drew curious glances from other guests, some appreciative, others confused. Most of Rebecca's friends had never seen a real military officer up close, and their whispered conversations carried a mix of respect and bewilderment. The older generation, particularly the men, nodded respectfully when they caught sight of my ribbons, though none approached to ask about my service. The reception hall buzzed with the energy of celebration. Waiters in crisp white shirts moved gracefully between tables, carrying trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The jazz band played softly in the background, their music mixing with the gentle hum of conversation and laughter. Everything was elegant, refined, and expensive, exactly the kind of event my parents loved to host. I checked my watch. 6:15 p.m. Dinner would be served soon, followed by the traditional speeches and dancing. I'd flown in from my current assignment at Naval Station Norfolk just that morning, using precious leave time to attend my sister's wedding. The flight had been delayed, leaving me barely enough time to change into my dress uniform before rushing to the ceremony. Part of me wondered if I should have worn civilian clothes instead. The uniform seemed to make some family members uncomfortable, as if my military service was something to be hidden rather than honored. But after 8 years of service, the dress blues represented who I had become, someone who had sworn an oath to defend her country and had kept that promise through multiple combat deployments. The sound of clinking glasses drew my attention to the head table, where David's family was taking their seats. His father, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and a confident bearing, caught my eye briefly. There was something about the way he carried himself that seemed familiar, though I couldn't place where I might have seen him before, The wedding coordinator began directing guests to find their assigned tables. I realized with growing dread that I still hadn't located my name on the seating chart. The elegant calligraphy listed table after table of guests, but Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell seemed to be nowhere to be found. I studied the seating chart more carefully, running my finger down each elegantly scripted list. Table 1 through 12 were filled with family members, close friends, and David's professional colleagues. My parents were seated at table 3 with other relatives. Rebecca's college friends occupied table 7. David's law firm partners and their spouses filled table 9. But my name was conspicuously absent from every adult table. Looking for something? My cousin Jennifer appeared beside me, her voice carrying that familiar tone of barely concealed superiority. At 35, Jennifer worked as a marketing executive in Richmond and never missed an opportunity to remind everyone about her corner office and company car. "Just trying to find my table assignment," I replied, keeping my voice neutral despite the growing knot in my stomach. Jennifer's perfectly manicured finger pointed toward the far corner of the reception hall, where a smaller round table sat almost hidden behind a decorative column. "Oh, you're over there. Table 13. Her smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "With the other young people." My heart sank as I followed her gesture. Table 13 was indeed smaller than the others, decorated with colorful balloons instead of elegant, floral arrangements. Seated around it were Rebecca's 3 young nephews from David's side, ages 8, 10, and 12, along with 2 teenage cousins and my sister's friend's 13-year-old daughter. The kids' table. "There must be some mistake," I said, my military training the only thing keeping my voice steady. "I'm 29 years old." Jennifer's laugh was like ice cracking. "Well, Rebecca said you don't really have a +1 or anything, and you know how tight space is at these things. Besides," she gestured dismissively at my dress uniform, "it's not like you're really settled down yet. Still playing dress up, I see." The comment hit like a physical blow. Playing dress up. 8 years of service, 3 combat deployments, leading troops through life or death situations, and my own family saw my uniform as nothing more than a costume. "Actually, Jennifer, this uniform represents—" "Oh, please," she interrupted, rolling her eyes dramatically. "We get it, Sarah. You joined the military instead of getting a real job. Very rebellious. But some of us have actual careers and responsibilities now." She adjusted her designer handbag strap. "Anyway, I need to find my husband. We're at table 4, naturally, with the other adults." As Jennifer clicked away on her expensive heels, I stood frozen by the seating chart, feeling smaller than I had since basic training. Around me, elegantly dressed guests found their tables with ease, greeting table mates with warm smiles and genuine enthusiasm. Meanwhile, I was expected to squeeze myself between a fidgety 8-year-old and a sulky teenager for my sister's wedding dinner. The worst part wasn't the table assignment itself. I'd eaten plenty of meals in much worse conditions during my deployments. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It was what the assignment represented: my family's complete dismissal of who I had become and what I had accomplished. To them, I was still just wayward Sarah, who had made questionable life choices and never quite measured up to their expectations. I made my way toward table 13, passing clusters of relatives who barely acknowledged my presence. Aunt Margaret nodded politely but quickly turned back to her conversation about vacation homes in the Outer Banks. My father's business partner, whom I'd known since childhood, gave me a brief wave before diving back into a discussion about golf. Handicaps with my uncle. The children at table 13 looked up as I approached, their faces a mixture of confusion and curiosity. 10-year-old Tommy, David's nephew, stared openly at my ribbons and insignia. "Are you a real soldier?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine wonder. "Navy officer," I corrected gently, taking my seat between him and his older brother Jake. "I serve on ships and at overseas bases." "That's so cool." Tommy's eyes widened. "Have you ever been in a battle?" Before I could answer, Jake scoffed from my other side. "Girls can't be real soldiers. My dad says they just do paperwork and stuff." The casual dismissal from a 12-year-old stung more than it should have, but it perfectly reflected the attitude I'd been fighting against my entire military career. Even here, at my own sister's wedding, surrounded by my own family, I couldn't escape the assumption that my service was somehow less legitimate or important. "Actually," I said quietly, "women serve in all branches of the military now. We do. Everything from flying combat missions to leading troops in dangerous situations." Tommy leaned forward eagerly. "Have you ever flown a plane?" "Not planes, but I have operated military vessels and led teams in some pretty challenging places," I replied, trying to keep the conversation age-appropriate while my mind wandered to convoy operations in Afghanistan that these children could never imagine. As dinner service began, I watched the adult tables receiving their perfectly plated meals while we were served from a different menu entirely. Chicken tenders and mac and cheese, apparently deemed more appropriate for the children's table. The irony was crushing. I had eaten military rations in combat zones while planning operations that affected hundreds of lives, yet here I was, being served the same meal as elementary school kids. From across the room, I caught sight of my parents, laughing with their table mates, completely absorbed in their own conversations. My mother looked radiant in her blue dress, gesturing animatedly as she told some story that had the entire table in stitches. Neither of them had so much as glanced in my direction since the reception began. Rebecca, glowing in her wedding dress, moved gracefully from table to table, greeting guests and accepting congratulations. When she reached the adult tables, she spent several minutes chatting and posing for photos. But when her eyes briefly met mine across the room, she offered only a quick, apologetic smile before turning her attention back to more important guests. The message was crystal clear. At my own sister's wedding, surrounded by my own family, I was an afterthought. The uniform I wore with pride was seen as an embarrassment. The service I had dedicated my life to was viewed as a phase I needed to outgrow. And the experiences that had shaped me into a leader were invisible to the people who were supposed to know me best. The chicken tenders sat untouched on my plate as conversations swirled around the adult tables, their laughter and animated discussions a stark contrast to the awkward silence that had settled over our corner of the reception hall. Tommy had returned to playing games on his phone, while Jake picked at his mac and cheese with obvious boredom. The teenage cousins were deep in their own whispered conversation about some social media drama from school. I found myself staring across the room at table 3, where my parents sat with their backs turned to me. completely engrossed in what appeared to be a fascinating discussion about property values with Uncle Robert and Aunt Linda. My father's booming laugh echoed across the reception hall every few minutes, the sound both familiar and distant. When was the last time he'd laughed like that with me? "Sarah!" My mother's voice cut through my thoughts as she approached our table, her blue dress rustling with each step. Her smile was bright but strained, the same expression she'd worn when explaining to neighbors why I'd chosen military service over law school. "How are you doing over here, sweetheart?" "Fine, Mom," I replied, standing respectfully as she reached our table. The children looked up curiously, unused to adult attention during wedding receptions. Good. She glanced around nervously, as if checking to see who might be watching our interaction. "Listen, I wanted to explain about the seating arrangement. It's just that Rebecca had so many important guests to accommodate, and with your schedule being so unpredictable, we thought you'd be more comfortable here with the younger crowd." The words stung, but I kept my expression neutral. "Important guests?" "Well, David's law partners, the judge from his firm, Rebecca's colleagues from the marketing agency." She gestured vaguely toward the adult tables. "People who are established in their careers, with families and responsibilities." "I see." I looked down at my dress uniform, at the ribbons that represented years of service, deployments, commendations. "And what category do I fall into?" Mom's smile faltered slightly. "Oh, Sarah, don't be dramatic. You know what I mean. You're still figuring things out, finding your path. There's nothing wrong with that, but these other guests, they're at a different stage of life." Tommy looked up from his phone, his young voice cutting through the tension. "But she's a Navy officer. She's been in battles and everything." Mother's laugh was forced and uncomfortable. "Well, that's very sweet, Tommy, but—" "Actually, Mrs. Mitchell," Jake interrupted, his 12-year-old arrogance suddenly replaced by genuine curiosity. "Sarah was telling us about leading troops and stuff. That sounds way cooler than my dad's accounting job." "Boys, please," Mom said, her voice taking on that sharp edge I remembered from childhood disciplinary moments. "Let's not encourage wild stories. Sarah, we really should discuss your future plans. When are you going to think about settling down? Finding a nice civilian job? Starting a real life?" The words hit like artillery fire. A real life, as if the last 8 years had been some extended childhood game rather than dedicated service to my country. "Mom, I have a real life. I'm a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy. I've led humanitarian missions, managed million-dollar operations, supervised dozens of personnel." Yes, she waved dismissively. "But what about marriage? Children? A stable job that doesn't require you to disappear for months at a time? Rebecca has built something solid with David. They have a future together, a real partnership." I glanced over at Rebecca, who was currently posing for photos with David's family near the head table. The photographer was capturing what would undoubtedly become the perfect wedding album, full of smiling faces and elegant poses. No one was asking Rebecca to justify her career choices or questioning whether her marketing job constituted a real life. "Sarah's job sounds way more important than Rebecca's," Tommy declared with the brutal honesty only children possess. "She protects people. Rebecca just makes commercials." "Tommy!" My mother's voice was sharp enough to cut crystal. "That's not appropriate. Your Aunt Rebecca has a very successful career in a respectable field. But why is that more respectable than protecting our country?" I asked quietly, my military training the only thing keeping my voice level. Mom looked around nervously again, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of our conversation. "It's not about respect, Sarah. It's about stability. About building something lasting. The military is fine for young people who don't know what they want to do, but at some point, you need to grow up and join the real world." The real world. The phrase echoed in my mind as I thought about convoy operations through hostile territory, coordinating with international allies during complex diplomatic missions, managing emergency evacuations during natural disasters. Apparently, none of that qualified as real to my own mother. Maybe the real world needs more people willing to serve something bigger than themselves, I said, my voice still controlled, but carrying an edge that made the children at our table sit up straighter. Oh, Sarah, don't start with that heroic nonsense. You sound like a recruiting poster. Mom's patience was clearly wearing thin. The point is, you're 29 years old, sitting at the children's table because you don't have a husband, a stable address, or a normal job. When are you going to take responsibility for your choices? The reception hall seemed to fall silent around us, though I knew the conversations at other tables continued uninterrupted. But in our small corner, with wide-eyed children watching this family drama unfold, the weight of my mother's words settled like lead in my chest. I am taking responsibility, I said, standing slowly from my chair. I took responsibility when I swore an oath to defend this country. I took responsibility when I led my unit through dangerous missions. I take responsibility every single day for the lives and safety of the people under my command. Mom's face flushed red, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Lower your voice, Sarah. People are staring. I looked around the reception hall, suddenly acutely aware that several nearby tables had indeed begun to notice our heated exchange. Aunt Margaret was openly eavesdropping, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth. Uncle Robert had turned in, his chair to get a better view of the drama unfolding at the children's table. Maybe they should stare, I said, my voice carrying more clearly now. Maybe they should hear about what real service looks like instead of just assuming everyone who doesn't fit their narrow definition of success is somehow failing at life. The confrontation was reaching a breaking point, and I could see genuine anger flashing in my mother's eyes. But before either of us could say something we'd truly regret, a deep, authoritative voice cut through our family tension like a blade. Excuse me, but did I hear correctly? Are you Lieutenant Commander Mitchell? I turned toward the voice, my military training automatically cataloging details. Mid-60s, silver-haired, ramrod straight posture, and eyes that held the unmistakable intensity of someone accustomed to command. The man approaching our table wore an impeccably tailored Navy suit, but everything about his bearing screamed military officer. This had to be David's father. Yes, sir, I'm Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, I replied, instinctively straightening to attention, despite still being seated at the children's table. The man's eyes moved methodically across my dress uniform, taking in each ribbon and insignia with the practiced assessment of someone who understood their significance. His gaze lingered on my combat action ribbon, my Afghanistan campaign medal, and the Navy Commendation Medal with Combat V device that few people outside the military would recognize. Colonel Richard Hastings, United States Marine Corps, retired, he said, extending his hand with the firm grip of a career military officer. Though most people here tonight just know me as David's father. My mother stood frozen beside our table, her mouth slightly open as she watched this distinguished gentleman treat me with the kind of respect she'd been denying me all evening. The children had gone completely silent, sensing that something significant was happening even if they didn't fully understand what. It's an honor to meet you, sir, I said, rising to shake his hand properly. Colonel Hastings studied my ribbons more carefully, his expression growing increasingly serious. Lieutenant Commander, would I be correct in assuming you served with the 3rd Fleet's humanitarian mission in the Philippines after Typhoon Maria? The question hit me like a physical blow. That mission, 3 years ago, had been one of the most challenging of my career. We'd coordinated massive relief efforts, evacuated thousands of civilians, and worked around the clock for 6 weeks to restore basic services to devastated communities. Yes, sir. I was the operations officer for the naval component of that mission. Something shifted in Colonel Hastings' expression, a mixture of recognition and what looked almost like awe. Mitchell. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell. My God! He turned to address my mother, who was still standing in stunned silence. Ma'am, Do you have any idea what your daughter accomplished during that operation? Mom blinked rapidly, clearly out of her depth. Well, she mentioned something about the Philippines, but something about the Philippines? Colonel Hastings's voice carried the kind of authority that made even grown adults stand straighter. Mrs. Mitchell, your daughter didn't just do something in the Philippines. She saved lives, thousands of them. The reception hall around us had begun to take notice of our conversation. Other guests were turning in their chairs, drawn by the intensity in Colonel Hastings's voice and the sight of two military officers in what appeared to be a very serious discussion. "Sir, you don't need to," I began, uncomfortable with the attention. "No, Lieutenant Commander, I absolutely do need to." He turned back to my mother, his voice carrying clearly across the nearby tables. 3 years ago, when Typhoon Maria devastated the northern Philippines, the international relief effort was a logistical nightmare. Multiple agencies, different countries, civilian authorities, and military units all trying to coordinate rescue and relief operations in a disaster zone. Mom looked around nervously as more guests began to listen, but Colonel Hastings continued, with the precision of a military briefing. The operation was falling apart. Too many moving parts, not enough coordination, and people were dying while we argued about jurisdiction and protocols. That's when Lieutenant Commander Mitchell stepped in. I felt my cheeks burning with embarrassment and pride in equal measure. "Sir, I was just doing my job." "Your job?" Colonel Hastings turned to face me directly. "Lieutenant Commander, you worked 72 hours straight to reorganize the entire relief effort. You developed a unified command structure that brought together 5 different nations, coordinated with local authorities who barely spoke English, and managed the logistics for the largest humanitarian airlift in Pacific Fleet history." The children at our table were staring up at me with wide eyes, while my mother looked like she'd been struck by lightning. Around us, conversations at other tables had stopped entirely, as Colonel Hastings' voice carried across the reception hall. "But that's not even the remarkable part," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "The remarkable part is what happened when the hospital in Tacloban was about to collapse from storm damage with 200 patients still inside." My heart started racing. I'd never talked about that day with my family, never mentioned the risks, or the decisions that had to be made in those critical hours. The local authorities said evacuation was impossible. The storm was still raging, the infrastructure was destroyed, and the nearest safe facility was over 100 miles away. Most people would have written off those patients as acceptable losses, but not Lieutenant Commander Mitchell. Colonel Hastings looked directly at my mother, whose face had gone pale. "Your daughter organized an evacuation convoy through hurricane conditions, coordinated with Marine helicopter squadrons to establish landing zones in impossible weather, and personally led the medical transport team that carried patients through flooded streets to safety." The reception hall had gone almost completely quiet now. Even the jazz band had stopped playing, sensing that something important was happening. Rebecca and David had moved closer to our table, their faces filled with confusion and growing amazement. "Every single patient survived," Colonel Hastings announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent room. 200 people who should have died that night went home to their families because Lieutenant Commander Mitchell refused to accept that their lives were expendable. I could feel tears threatening at the corners of my eyes as the memories of that night came flooding back. The wind howling through the damaged hospital, the fear in the patient's eyes, the impossible decisions that had to be made in minutes rather than hours. "Sir," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper, "how do you know all this?" Colonel Hastings smiled, the first genuine warmth I'd seen from him since our conversation began. "Because, Lieutenant Commander, my son Michael was one of the Marine pilots who answered your call that night. He's told that story so many times I could recite it in my sleep." The revelation hit like a thunderbolt. The Marine helicopter pilots who had risked everything to help with the evacuation. One of them was this man's son. "Michael has been trying to track you down for 3 years to thank you personally." Colonel Hastings continued. He said you gave him the coordinates for landing zones that shouldn't have been possible, guided his squadron through weather that should have grounded them, and saved more lives in one night than most people do in a lifetime. My mother was staring at me as if seeing me for the first time, her face a mixture of shock, confusion, and something that might have been pride. Around us, the entire reception had become an audience to this unexpected revelation about the woman who had been relegated to the children's table. The silence in the reception hall was deafening. 200 wedding guests sat frozen, their champagne glasses suspended halfway to their lips, their conversations abandoned as the weight of Colonel Hastings's words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. At the children's table, Tommy stared up at me with the kind of awe usually reserved for superheroes, while even Jake had put down his phone to listen. My mother's face cycled through a dozen different emotions: shock, confusion, disbelief, and, finally, something that looked like the beginning of understanding. Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the way her complexion had gone from flushed anger to pale realization in the span of minutes. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ambient sounds of the reception hall. "You never told us. I mean, we knew you were deployed, but you never said—" "She never said what, Mom?" The words came out sharper than I intended. 8 years of hidden frustration finally finding their voice. That I was doing something meaningful? That I was making a difference? That maybe my phase was actually a career worth respecting? Colonel Hastings stepped slightly closer, his presence commanding even in the midst of our family drama. "Mrs. Mitchell, if I may, your daughter is what we call a quiet professional. The best military officers don't talk about their accomplishments because they see extraordinary service as simply doing their job." From across the room, I could see my father making his way through the tables. His face creased with confusion as he tried to understand why his daughter was suddenly the center of attention at Rebecca's wedding reception. Uncle Robert and Aunt Linda were right behind him, along with Cousin Jennifer, whose earlier smugness had been replaced by obvious bewilderment. "Dad," I stood as he approached, my military-bearing automatic even in this surreal family moment. "Sarah, what's going on here?" His voice carried the same dismissive tone he'd used when I first announced my intention to join the Navy. "Who is this gentleman? And why is everyone staring?" Colonel Hastings extended his hand with the same formal courtesy he'd shown me. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Colonel Richard Hastings, United States Marine Corps, retired. I was just telling your wife about your daughter's remarkable service record." Dad shook the offered hand with obvious reluctance, his businessman's skepticism evident in every line of his body. "Service record? Look, Colonel, I appreciate what you military folks do, but Sarah's just been playing soldier for a few years. We're hoping she'll settle down soon and find a real career." The words hit the reception hall like a physical slap. Several guests gasped audibly, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Colonel Hastings' expression hardened into something that would have made seasoned Marines take a step backward. "Playing soldier?" His voice carried the kind of cold authority that had probably terrified subordinates for decades. "Mr. Mitchell, your daughter isn't playing anything. She's a decorated combat veteran who has saved more lives than most doctors and prevented more disasters than most emergency coordinators. Now see here," Dad began, his face reddening with embarrassment and anger. "No, sir. You see here." Colonel Hastings's interruption was delivered with surgical precision. 3 years ago, when Typhoon Maria hit the Philippines, the international relief effort was collapsing under its own weight. Multiple nations, dozens of agencies, and thousands of personnel were all working at cross purposes while people died in the wreckage. Rebecca had moved close enough to hear every word, her wedding dress rustling as she stood transfixed by this revelation about her sister. David stood beside her, his expression shifting from confusion to growing amazement as he began to understand exactly who his new sister-in-law really was. "Your daughter, Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, took command of that chaos and turned it into the most successful humanitarian operation in recent Pacific Fleet history." Colonel Hastings continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the now silent reception hall. She worked 3 straight days without sleep, coordinated 5 different nations' military assets, and personally led the evacuation of a collapsing hospital through hurricane conditions. Jennifer, who had been so quick to dismiss my uniform as playing dress-up, now stood with her mouth hanging open, her designer handbag clutched forgotten in her hands. The marketing executive who had sneered at my lack of a real career was learning that while she'd been crafting advertising campaigns, I'd been saving lives in combat zones. "But that's not even the whole story," Colonel Hastings said, turning to address the entire reception hall as if giving a formal presentation. "Because what Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell apparently don't know is that their daughter didn't just coordinate that evacuation. She volunteered to be on the last helicopter out, personally ensuring that every single patient was safely evacuated before she would leave her post." The gasp that rippled through the reception hall was audible this time. 200 wedding guests were learning that the woman who had been relegated to the children's table was, in fact, a genuine hero who had risked her own life to save others. My mother's composure finally cracked. Tears began streaming down her face, smearing her carefully applied mascara as the full weight of her earlier words hit home. She had spent the evening treating her daughter like a failure, while that daughter had actually spent years serving with distinction and honor. "Sarah," Rebecca's voice cut through the tension, filled with a mixture of awe and something that sounded like guilt. "I had no idea. You never told us about any of this." I looked at my sister, beautiful in her wedding dress, surrounded by the life she'd built according to our parents' expectations. "Would you have listened if I had told you? Or would you have just heard more stories about my phase that I needed to outgrow?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Around us, the reception hall remained frozen in this moment of revelation, 200 people witnessing a family confronting truths they'd never wanted to see. Colonel Hastings placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, the gesture carrying the weight of military brotherhood and shared understanding. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the assembled guests, "you are in the presence of one of the finest officers it has been my privilege to know about. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell represents the very best of military service, selfless, competent, and dedicated to something far greater than herself." As his words echoed through the reception hall, I watched my family's faces transform from confusion to understanding, from dismissal to recognition, from embarrassment to something that might eventually become pride. The children's table where I'd been seated suddenly seemed less like exile and more like the staging ground for a battle I'd never expected to fight, the battle for my own family's respect. The reception hall remained suspended in this moment of revelation, as if time itself had stopped to witness the unraveling of 8 years of family misunderstanding. Colonel Hastings stood beside me like a guardian angel in a Navy suit, his presence transforming what had been a humiliating exile into a platform for recognition that my family had never thought to offer. "But Colonel," my father said, his voice smaller now, deflated by the weight of public embarrassment, "she never told us about any of this. How were we supposed to know?" The question hung in the air like an accusation turned back on itself. "Colonel," Hastings' expression softened slightly, but his voice retained its military precision. "Mr. Mitchell, with respect, did you ever ask? Did you ever inquire about what your daughter actually did during her deployments, or did you simply assume it wasn't worth knowing?" The silence that followed was deafening. Around us, wedding guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unwilling, witnesses to a family's reckoning with their own prejudices. The jazz band remained frozen with their instruments, unsure whether to resume playing or continue watching this unexpected drama unfold. Tommy, the 10-year-old who had been so fascinated by my uniform, suddenly spoke up with the brutal honesty only children possess. "My mom always says that if you don't ask questions about what people do, it's because you don't really want to know the answer." The child's words hit my father like a physical blow. His face crumpled as he realized that in 8 years of my military service, he had never once asked for details about my missions, my responsibilities, or my accomplishments. Every conversation about my career had been focused on when I would leave it behind, not what I was achieving within it. My mother wiped at her streaming makeup with a cocktail napkin, her carefully constructed appearance as disheveled as her emotional state. "Sarah, honey, I'm so sorry. We thought—" "You thought what, Mom?" I asked, my voice gentler now as I watched my family grapple with the enormity of their misconceptions. That I was wasting my life? That I was avoiding real responsibility? That everything I've done for the past 8 years was just an extended temper tantrum? Rebecca stepped forward, her wedding dress rustling with each movement. For the first time all evening, she looked directly at me instead of through me. "Sarah, I need to apologize. The seating arrangement, the way we've treated your service, I had no idea what you've accomplished." "But that's just it, Rebecca," I replied, feeling 8 years of hidden hurt finally finding its voice. "You didn't want to know. None of you did." It was easier to see me as the family disappointment than to consider that maybe I'd found something worth dedicating my life to. Colonel Hastings cleared his throat, drawing attention back to himself. "If I may offer some perspective from someone who has spent 40 years in military service," he said, his voice carrying across the silent reception hall. "The most challenging part of military life isn't the deployments, the combat, or even the physical dangers. It's coming home to people who see your uniform as a costume rather than a calling." His words resonated through the reception hall like a bell tolling. Several guests nodded in recognition, perhaps remembering their own family members who had served or their own failures to understand the significance of military service. "Lieutenant Commander Mitchell," Colonel Hastings continued, turning to face me directly, "has spent 8 years serving her country with distinction, while her own family treated her achievements as embarrassments. That takes a special kind of courage, not just the bravery to face enemy fire, but the strength to continue serving despite lack of support from the people who should be proudest of her accomplishments." David, who had been silent throughout this entire exchange, finally found his voice. "Sarah, I had no idea. If I had known, the seating arrangement never would have happened." I looked at my new brother-in-law, seeing genuine remorse in his expression. "David, you're not responsible for your family's assumptions about military service, but maybe now you understand why I wasn't particularly excited about this reception." The weight of Colonel Hastings' revelations was beginning to transform the atmosphere in the reception hall. Guests who had barely acknowledged my presence earlier were now staring at me with newfound respect. Conversations were beginning to restart, but they were different now, filled with the kind of reverent tones people use when discussing genuine heroes, rather than family black sheep. Uncle Robert, who had spent the earlier part of the evening discussing golf handicaps, approached our group with obvious discomfort. "Sarah, I owe you an apology. We all do. I served briefly in Vietnam, and I should have known better." His admission opened the floodgates. One by one, family members and guests began approaching, offering apologies, asking questions, and expressing genuine interest in my military service for the first time in 8 years. The transformation was remarkable. Where earlier I had been invisible, now I was the center of respectful attention. But the most profound change was in my parents. My father, the successful businessman who had always measured worth in terms of salary and status, stood with tears in his eyes as he began to understand that his daughter had spent years leading people, making life or death decisions, and serving something far greater than profit margins. My mother, who had worried for years about my lack of a normal life, was beginning to realize that normal might not be the highest aspiration for someone capable of extraordinary service. "Sarah," Mom said, her voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how to apologize for what we've put you through. We were so wrong, so completely wrong about everything. The children's table where I had been seated now seemed like a symbol of transformation, rather than humiliation. Tommy looked up at me with undiminished awe, while Jake had abandoned his earlier skepticism entirely. Even the teenage cousins were staring at me with the kind of respect usually reserved for celebrities or sports heroes. Colonel Hastings smiled, satisfied with the evening's revelations. "Lieutenant Commander, I believe my son Michael would very much like to reconnect with you. He's currently stationed at Quantico, and he's never forgotten what you did for his squadron and those patients in the Philippines." As the reception hall slowly returned to life around us, with conversations resuming and the band preparing to play again, I realized that everything had indeed changed, just as the hook had promised. My family was speechless. My sister had tears in her eyes, and for the first time in 8 years, I felt truly seen by the people who had raised me. The kids' table had become the most important table at the wedding. The jazz band finally resumed playing, but the music seemed different now, softer, more respectful, as if even the musicians understood that something profound had shifted in the reception hall. Conversations gradually returned to normal volume, but I noticed how many guests kept glancing in my direction, their expressions a mixture of respect and curiosity that hadn't been there an hour earlier. Colonel Hastings excused himself to return to his table, but not before pressing a business card into my hand. "Lieutenant Commander, my son Michael is stationed at Quantico. I know he would be honored to reconnect with you, and if you're ever in the DC area, my wife and I would be privileged to have you for dinner." As he walked away, I found myself still standing beside the children's table that had become the unexpected center of the evening's most important conversation. Tommy tugged at my uniform sleeve, his young face serious with the weight of new understanding. "Sarah, are you going to sit with us for the rest of dinner?" he asked. "Because I think you're way too cool for the grown-up tables anyway." His innocent words brought the first genuine smile I'd felt all evening. "Actually, Tommy, I think I'd like that very much." But Rebecca appeared at my elbow before I could sit back down, her wedding dress rustling as she positioned herself between me and the children's table. Her face was streaked with tears, but these weren't the happy tears of a bride. These were the tears of someone confronting the weight of their own mistakes. "Sarah, please," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't let you sit here anymore. Not after everything we've just learned." I looked at my sister, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time in years. She was still the successful marketing executive, still the golden child who had followed every expectation our parents had set for her. But now, there was something else in her expression, genuine remorse and what looked like the beginning of real respect. "Rebecca, it's okay. The table assignment doesn't matter anymore." "But it does matter," she insisted, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "It matters because it represents everything wrong with how our family has treated you. You're a war hero, Sarah. You've saved lives, led troops, served our country with honor, and we stuck you at the kids' table because we thought you weren't successful enough for the adult conversation." The nearby guests couldn't help but overhear, and I watched as understanding dawned on more faces around the reception hall. The woman who had been dismissed as the family disappointment was actually the family's greatest success story. They just hadn't bothered to learn about it. David joined his new wife, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. "Sarah, we'd like you to join us at the head table. It's where you should have been all along." The offer was generous, but I found myself looking back at Tommy and Jake, at the teenage cousins who had witnessed this entire transformation. These children had shown more interest in my military service in one evening than my adult family members had displayed in 8 years. "That's very kind of you," I said, "but I think I'll stay here. These kids have asked better questions about military service than most adults ever do." Tommy beamed with pride while Jake nodded seriously, as if he'd been entrusted with an important responsibility. The teenage cousins straightened in their chairs, suddenly aware that they were part of something significant. My mother approached. Again, her makeup now completely beyond repair, but her expression clearer than I'd seen it in years. "Sarah, there's something I need to say to you, and I want everyone to hear it." She turned to address the reception hall, her voice carrying, with the determination of someone who had finally found the courage to speak truth. "Ladies and gentlemen, I owe my daughter Sarah a public apology. For 8 years, I've treated her military service as something to be embarrassed about, something she needed to outgrow. I was wrong. Completely, utterly wrong." The reception hall fell quiet again, all attention focused on my mother's unexpected confession. "My daughter is a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "She has served our country with distinction, saved lives in combat zones, and accomplished things I never even bothered to ask about because I was too focused on what I thought she should be doing instead." She paused, wiping away fresh tears. "I'm proud of you, Sarah. I should have said that years ago, and I'm ashamed that it took a stranger to tell me about my own daughter's heroism." The applause started slowly, just a few guests clapping respectfully. But it built gradually until the entire reception hall was applauding, not for the bride and groom, but for the woman who had spent the evening at the children's table. My father stepped forward as the applause died down, his businessman's composure completely abandoned. "Sarah, I've spent 8 years waiting for you to come to your senses and join the real world. Tonight I learned that you've been living in the real world all along. A world where people sacrifice for others, where leadership means putting yourself at risk for the people you're responsible for, where success is measured in lives saved, rather than dollars earned." He paused, struggling with emotions I'd never seen him express. "I don't know how to make up for 8 years of not understanding, but I'd like to start learning. Would you tell me about the Philippines? About what you actually do when you deploy?" The question I'd been waiting 8 years to hear finally came, and it came from the man who had spent those 8 years dismissing everything I'd accomplished. I looked around the reception hall, at family members and guests who were seeing me clearly for the first time, at children who had embraced my service with more enthusiasm than my own parents. "Dad," I said, my voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside me. "I'd be honored to tell you about my service, all of it. But it might take a while." He smiled through his tears. "We have time, all the time you need." As the reception returned to its celebration around us, I remained at table 13 with my new young allies, finally understanding that sometimes the most important victories aren't won on foreign battlefields. They're won in the hearts and minds of the people who are supposed to love you most. The kids' table had become the place where my family finally learned to see me as I really was. Not the daughter who had lost her way, but the daughter who had found her calling and followed it with honor. The remainder of the reception unfolded like a completely different event than the one I had arrived to hours earlier. Where conversations had once flowed around me without acknowledgement, I now found myself at the center of genuine interest and respect. The transformation wasn't just in my family. It had rippled outward through the entire gathering, changing how every guest viewed both military service and the assumptions we make about the people closest to us. As the evening progressed, something remarkable began to happen. Guests who had barely glanced in my direction earlier now approached the children's table with a mixture of curiosity and reverence. Mr. Patterson, one of David's law partners, came over during dessert to thank me for my service and share stories about his own father's World War II experiences. Mrs. Chen, Rebecca's colleague from the marketing agency, apologized for not engaging me in conversation earlier and asked thoughtful questions about women's roles in modern military operations. But perhaps the most meaningful interaction came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Eleanor Walsh, David's elderly grandmother, made her way slowly across the reception hall with the aid of her walker, her 92-year-old frame moving with determination that reminded me of seasoned military personnel. "Young lady," she said, settling into the chair that Jake had quickly vacated for her, I haven't heard military stories that impressive since my late husband returned from Normandy. Her weathered hands shook slightly as she reached for mine, but her grip was surprisingly strong. Harold would have been so proud to meet you. He always said that the measure of a soldier wasn't in the medals they wore, but in the lives they touched and the people they brought home safely. Tommy leaned forward with rapt attention. Mrs. Walsh, was your husband really at D-Day? Indeed, he was, young man. And like Lieutenant Commander Mitchell here, he spent most of his life afterward downplaying what he'd accomplished, because he believed that extraordinary service was simply doing what needed to be done. Her words carried the weight of lived experience, of someone who had watched heroes return home only to have their accomplishments minimized by a society that didn't fully understand the cost of freedom. As she spoke, I realized I was part of a continuum, generations of service members who had sacrificed for others, only to find that their greatest battles sometimes came after returning home. Mrs. Walsh, I said quietly, would you tell us more about your husband's service? What followed was 30 minutes of the most captivating storytelling I'd ever heard. Mrs. Walsh painted vivid pictures of Harold's experiences during the war, but more importantly, she described the quiet dignity with which he had carried those experiences throughout his civilian life. Her stories drew an audience, not just the children at our table, but adults from nearby tables who found themselves leaning in to listen. As she spoke, I noticed my parents among the listeners, their faces reflecting a growing understanding of something larger than themselves. They were beginning to comprehend that military service wasn't just a career choice or a temporary adventure. It was a calling that connected people across generations, binding them together through shared values of sacrifice, honor, and duty. When Mrs. Walsh finished her stories, the table remained silent for a moment, absorbing the weight of history and heroism. Then Tommy, with the wonderful directness of childhood, asked the question that had been hovering in the air all evening. So does this mean Sarah gets to sit at the grown-up table now? The question might have seemed innocent, but it cut straight to the heart of the evening's revelations. Mrs. Walsh smiled, her eyes twinkling with wisdom earned through nearly a century of life. My dear boy, she said, patting Tommy's hand gently, Lieutenant Commander Mitchell has been sitting at the grown-up table all along. The rest of us just needed our eyes opened to see it. Her words triggered something in Rebecca, who had been hovering nearby throughout Mrs. Walsh's storytelling. My sister approached the table again, her composure finally restored but her expression still carrying the weight of the evening's revelations. Sarah, she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. I looked up at my sister, noting how different she seemed now, less polished, more real, as if the perfect facade of the successful marketing executive had cracked to reveal something more authentic underneath. Of course, Rebecca. What do you want to know? How many times over the years did you want to tell us about your deployments, your missions, the things you were actually doing? How many times did we shut you down or change the subject because we thought we already knew everything we needed to know about your phase? The question hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. I thought back through 8 years of family gatherings, holiday conversations, and brief phone calls home during deployments. How many times had I started to share something meaningful, only to be met with polite disinterest or gentle suggestions that I start thinking about my future after the military? Honestly, Rebecca, every time, every single family gathering, every phone call home, every leave when I came back with stories about the people I'd met and the missions we'd accomplished. I wanted to share it all with you because you're my family, and I was proud of what we were doing. My sister's face crumpled again, fresh tears threatening to spill. We robbed ourselves of 8 years of your stories, didn't we? 8 years of being proud of you instead of worried about you. Around the table, family members who had gathered to listen to Mrs. Walsh's stories now found themselves confronting their own failures of understanding. Uncle Robert, who had served briefly in Vietnam, nodded grimly as he recognized his own part in dismissing my experiences. Cousin Jennifer stood silent, her earlier smugness replaced by obvious shame. But perhaps the most profound change was visible in my parents. My father, the successful businessman who had measured worth in terms of profit and loss, was beginning to understand that some accomplishments couldn't be quantified in quarterly reports. My mother, who had worried for years about my lack of a normal life, was finally grasping that normal might not be the highest aspiration for someone capable of extraordinary service. As the reception began winding down and guests started saying their goodbyes, I realized that the evening had accomplished something I never could have anticipated. It had opened a door that had been closed for 8 years, not just between my family and me, but between civilian society and the military members who serve it. The children's table had become a classroom where everyone learned that heroism doesn't always announce itself with fanfare, that the most significant accomplishments are often carried quietly by people who see extraordinary service as simply doing their job. As the evening drew to a close, the reception hall began to empty with the slow, reluctant pace of an event that had exceeded everyone's expectations. But this wasn't the typical post-wedding atmosphere of satisfied guests heading home after a lovely celebration. This felt different, heavier somehow, as if everyone present understood they had witnessed something that would change how they thought about service, family, and the assumptions we make about the people we think we know. The children from table 13 had become my unofficial honor guard for the evening. Tommy insisted on helping me gather my things, while Jake asked if he could have my email address to send me questions about military life. The teenage cousins, who had started the evening sulking about being stuck at the kids' table, now wore expressions of genuine pride at having been part of something historically significant. "Sarah," Tommy said, tugging at my uniform sleeve one final time. "When I grow up, I want to be like you. Is that okay?" The question hit me with unexpected force. Here was a 10-year-old who had spent a few hours hearing about military service and immediately understood its value in a way that had taken my own family 8 years to recognize. "Tommy, you can be anything you want to be when you grow up," I replied, kneeling down to his eye level. "But remember, being a hero isn't about wearing a uniform. It's about choosing to help others, even when it's difficult or dangerous, or when nobody notices what you're doing." As I stood up, I found my parents waiting nearby, their faces carrying expressions I hadn't seen since childhood, genuine pride mixed with something that looked like awe. The successful businessman and his perfectly put-together wife had been replaced by two people who were finally seeing their daughter clearly for the first time in years. "Sarah," my father said, his voice thick with emotion, "we'd like to drive you back to your hotel. If that's okay with you, we have a lot to talk about, and 8 years of catching up to do." The offer represented more than just transportation. It was an invitation to rebuild a relationship that had been damaged by years of misunderstanding and missed opportunities. I looked at my parents, these two people who had raised me but had somehow lost sight of who I had become, and realized that tonight had been as transformative for them as it had been for me. "I'd like that very much," I replied. Rebecca appeared, at my side, still beautiful in her wedding dress, but somehow more real than she had been all evening. The perfect bride facade had been replaced by something more genuine, a sister who was finally ready to know her sibling as she truly was. "Sarah, before you go," she said, reaching into her clutch purse and pulling out her phone, "I want to take a picture of you in your uniform, a real picture, where you're not hidden in the corner or treated like an afterthought. I want to remember tonight, and I want everyone who sees this photo to know how proud I am of my sister." As Rebecca positioned her phone to capture the moment, other family members and guests began gathering around. What started as a simple sister's photo became an impromptu celebration of military service, with Tommy and Jake flanking me like junior officers, Mrs. Walsh standing proudly beside us with her walker, and my parents finally positioning themselves. where they belonged, right behind their daughter, their faces glowing with the pride they should have shown years ago. Colonel Hastings, who had been preparing to leave with David's family, noticed the gathering and approached with a smile that spoke of satisfaction at a job well done. "Lieutenant Commander," he said, extending his hand one final time, "it has been an honor to meet you and to witness your family's awakening to what I've known from the moment I saw your ribbons. You are an exceptional officer and an extraordinary human being." He paused, reaching into his jacket pocket. "I took the liberty of calling my son Michael while you were talking with Mrs. Walsh. He's driving down from Quantico tomorrow morning. He said he's waited 3 years to thank you in person, and he's not waiting another day." The revelation sent a ripple of excitement through the gathered family members. Not only had they learned about my military accomplishments, but now they would get to meet one of the Marines whose life had been impacted by my service. The abstract concept of my military career was becoming real in ways they could finally understand. As the photographer Rebecca had hired for the wedding began packing up his equipment, she called him over to capture these final moments. What resulted wasn't just a family photo, it was documentation of a transformation, a visual record of the moment when misunderstanding gave way to recognition, when dismissal transformed into respect. David, who had been quiet for much of the evening's revelations, finally approached as the photo session concluded. "Sarah, I owe you an apology not just for tonight, but for never asking Rebecca to tell me more about her sister who serves in the Navy. I promise you that oversight ends now." As we prepared to leave the reception hall, I took one last look. At table 13, the children's table that had inadvertently become the most important table at the wedding. It stood there with its colorful balloons and simpler place settings, no longer a symbol of exile, but a reminder that sometimes the most profound transformations happen in the most unexpected places. The kids' table had taught my family that heroism doesn't always sit at the head table, that the most important stories aren't always told in the spotlight, and that sometimes the people we think we know best are actually strangers whose true selves we've never bothered to discover. Walking toward the exit with my parents on either side of me, I realized that Colonel Hastings had given my family more than just information about my military service. He had given them a chance to see me as I truly was, rather than as they had assumed me to be. The woman who had arrived that evening, feeling like an outsider at her own sister's wedding, was leaving as a recognized hero, surrounded by family members who were finally ready to hear her stories. Tomorrow, Michael would arrive from Quantico, and my parents would get to meet the Marine pilot whose life had been saved by their daughter's actions in the Philippines. They would hear firsthand accounts of my leadership under fire, my calm decision-making in crisis situations, and the respect I had earned from fellow service members. But tonight, for the first time in 8 years, I was going home with my family, not as the daughter who had lost her way, but as the daughter who had found her calling and followed it with honor. The children's table had become the place where my family finally learned to see me as I really was. The next morning arrived with the soft Virginia sunshine streaming through the hotel curtains, but I had been awake since 0500 out of pure habit. Military schedules don't pause for emotional revelations or family reconciliations, and my internal clock remained as precise as ever. What was different was the feeling in my chest, lighter somehow, as if a weight I'd carried for 8 years had finally been lifted. My phone showed 17 missed messages from family members, something that had never happened in my entire military career. Rebecca had sent photos from the wedding reception, but not the typical bride and groom shots you'd expect. Instead, they were pictures of me in my dress uniform, surrounded by family members who were finally looking at me with pride instead of pity. The message that caught my attention, however, was from an unknown number with a Quantico area code. "Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, this is Captain Michael Hastings, USMC. My father said you'd be expecting me. I'm about 30 minutes out from your hotel. Would it be possible to meet for coffee? I've been waiting 3 years for this conversation, As I prepared to meet the Marine pilot whose life had intersected with mine during that chaotic night in the Philippines, I reflected on how dramatically everything had changed in less than 24 hours. Yesterday morning, I had been the family disappointment heading to a wedding where I'd be seated with children. Today, I was a recognized hero about to reunite with a fellow service member who considered me a lifesaver. The hotel lobby buzzed with typical Saturday morning activity, but I spotted Captain Hastings immediately. He stood near the entrance with the unmistakable bearing of a Marine officer, shoulders back, alert eyes, and a confidence that came from years of dangerous flying missions. When our eyes met across the lobby, his face broke into a grin that could have powered the entire hotel. "Lieutenant Commander Mitchell," he said, approaching with quick, purposeful strides. "Ma'am, you have no idea how long I've wanted to shake your hand." Captain Michael Hastings was younger than I'd expected, probably in his late 20s, with the kind of weathered look that came from flying helicopters in combat zones. His handshake was firm, respectful, and carried the weight of shared military experience. "Captain Hastings," I replied, "the honor is mine. Your father spoke very highly of your service last night. Please, call me Mike. And ma'am. With respect, my father doesn't know the half of what you accomplished that night in the Philippines. None of the official reports captured what it was really like on the ground." We settled into a quiet corner of the hotel's coffee shop, away from the morning crowd of business travelers and weekend tourists. Mike ordered black coffee, a pilot's drink, while I opted for the same. There was something comfortable about sitting across from someone who understood military life, someone who had been there during one of the most challenging operations of my career. "Lieutenant Commander," Mike began, his voice carrying the weight of long-held gratitude, "I need to tell you what that night meant to my squadron, to those patients, and to me personally." As he spoke, the memories came flooding back with vivid clarity. The howling wind, the desperate voices on the radio, the impossible decisions that had to be made in minutes rather than hours. But Mike's perspective added layers to the story that I had never known. "When you came on the radio that night, our entire squadron was grounded," he explained, his eyes distant with the memory. "Command had declared the weather too dangerous for helicopter operations. We were listening to the medical teams at the hospital describing the building collapse, knowing that 200 people were going to die, and there wasn't anything we could do about it. I remembered the frustration in the pilots' voices, the desperation in the medical team's reports, and the weight of knowing that conventional evacuation protocols were completely inadequate for the situation we faced. Then you took command of the operation," Mike continued, his voice filled with admiration. "Not just the naval component, but the entire evacuation effort. You established new landing zones in impossible terrain, coordinated with local authorities who barely spoke English, and somehow convinced 3 different national commands to work together instead of against each other." The coffee shop around us faded into background noise as Mike described the operation from the aircrew perspective. His words painted a picture of leadership and innovation that I had never fully appreciated from my position on the ground. "But here's what the official reports don't mention," he said, leaning forward with increased intensity. "You didn't just coordinate the evacuation, you revolutionized how we approach disaster response in hostile weather conditions. The protocols you developed that night are now standard operating procedure for Pacific Fleet humanitarian operations." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. I had known the evacuation was successful, but I had never learned that my improvised solutions had become part of official military doctrine. "Ma'am, you saved more than 200 lives that night," Mike continued. "You changed how the entire Pacific Fleet responds to humanitarian crises, and you did it all while personally leading evacuation teams through conditions that should have killed everyone involved." As Mike shared more details about the operation, the impossible weather conditions, the collapsing infrastructure, the coordination between multiple military branches, I began to understand why Colonel Hastings had been so impressed the night before. The mission I had seen as simply doing my job under difficult circumstances had actually been something far more significant. "Mike," I said quietly, "I had no idea the impact had been that widespread. We just focused on getting those patients out safely." "That's exactly what made it so remarkable," he replied. "You never thought about recognition or career advancement. You just saw people who needed help and figured out how to help them, regardless of the obstacles." Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of my parents in the hotel lobby, followed closely by Rebecca and David. Word of Mike's visit had apparently spread through the family overnight, and they had come to witness this reunion between their daughter and the Marine pilot whose life she had helped save. As introductions were made and my family settled around our table, I watched their faces as Mike continued sharing details about the Philippines operation. This wasn't just a story anymore. It was real-time validation from someone who had been there, who had witnessed my leadership firsthand, who could describe with military precision exactly what their daughter had accomplished. "Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell," Mike said, addressing my parents directly. "I know my father spoke with you last night about Lieutenant Commander Mitchell's service, but I want you to understand something from someone who was actually there. Your daughter didn't just save lives that night, she redefined what's possible when leadership, innovation, and courage come together under impossible circumstances." The pride on my parents' faces was unmistakable now, no longer mixed with confusion or embarrassment. They were finally hearing their daughter's story from someone who understood its true significance, someone whose own life had been touched by her actions. As our impromptu family gathering settled around the hotel coffee shop table, Mike pulled out his phone and scrolled through what appeared to be official military documentation. The casual coffee meeting was transforming into something more formal, a briefing that would finally give my family the complete picture of what their daughter had accomplished during her years of service. "Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell," Mike began, his voice taking on the precise tone of a military presentation, "what I'm about to show you is declassified mission footage from that night in the Philippines. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell probably doesn't even know this exists." He was right. I had no idea that helmet cameras and drone surveillance had captured parts of our evacuation operation. As Mike positioned his phone so the family could see the screen, I felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. Military operations rarely look as clean and heroic as civilians expect them to. Real leadership in crisis situations is messy, improvised, and filled with split-second decisions that could go wrong at any moment. The footage began with aerial shots of the devastated hospital, its roof partially collapsed and debris scattered across what had once been a functioning medical facility. Even 3 years later, the images were sobering. You could see patients on stretchers in the corridors, medical staff working by flashlight, and the growing pools of water as the storm continued to rage outside. "This is the situation your daughter inherited at 2100 hours, Mike explained, his voice steady but reverent. Multiple command structures arguing about jurisdiction, weather conditions that had grounded all aircraft, and a building that structural engineers said could collapse completely at any moment. My mother gasped audibly as the footage showed the true extent of the damage. This wasn't the sanitized version of military operations that appears in news reports. This was raw, dangerous, and clearly spiraling toward disaster. "Sarah," my father said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "You went into that?" Before I could answer, Mike continued the briefing. "The next footage is from Lieutenant Commander Mitchell's helmet camera. This shows her first assessment of the situation and the moment she took command of the entire operation. What followed was perhaps the most surreal experience of my life. Watching myself from 3 years ago making decisions that I remembered as pure instinct and adrenaline, but which now looked calculated and confident through the lens of this camera. You could hear my voice clearly over the radio, coordinating with multiple agencies, establishing new protocols, and turning chaos into organized action. Listen to her voice. Mike instructed my family. No panic, no uncertainty. She's processing information from 5 different sources, calculating weather windows, and coordinating assets from 3 different nations simultaneously. Rebecca leaned forward, studying the footage intently. Sarah, how did you know what to do? I mean, was this something you'd trained for? The question cut to the heart of military leadership. The difference between following established procedures and creating new solutions when those procedures fail. Actually, Rebecca, there was no training for this specific situation, I replied. We had protocols for hospital evacuations, procedures for severe weather operations, and guidelines for international coordination. But we'd never faced all 3 challenges simultaneously in a disaster zone. Mike nodded approvingly. That's what made Lieutenant Commander Mitchell's response so remarkable. She took existing military doctrine and adapted it in real time to meet an unprecedented challenge. The footage continued, showing scenes that I remembered with crystal clarity, but had never seen from an external perspective. There was the moment when I realized the standard landing zones were unusable and had to establish new ones using debris from the storm. The coordination with local authorities who spoke limited English, requiring me to communicate through a guise, combination of military hand signals and broken Tagalog phrases I'd learned from Filipino sailors. But the most powerful moment came when the footage showed the actual patient evacuation. You could see me personally carrying patients through knee-deep floodwater, coordinating with Mike's helicopter squadron through impossible weather conditions, and making the decision to be on the last helicopter out, ensuring that every patient was evacuated before I would leave my post. "Ma'am," Mike said, pausing the footage at a frame that showed me loading the final patient onto a Marine helicopter. "That decision to stay until the end, that's not in any manual. That's personal character under pressure." The coffee shop around us had grown quiet. Other patrons apparently drawn to our table by the intensity of the conversation and the military footage playing on Mike's phone. An elderly man at a nearby table, clearly a veteran based on his Vietnam War cap, had been listening intently and finally approached our group. "Excuse me," he said respectfully, "but I couldn't help overhearing. Young lady, are you the officer they're talking about?" When I nodded, he extended his weathered hand with obvious reverence. "Son," he said to Mike, "this is the kind of leadership we needed more of in my day. Takes real character to innovate under fire and put everyone else's safety ahead of your own." The veteran's validation added another layer to my family's understanding. This wasn't just about one successful mission. It was about a type of leadership that transcended specific military operations and spoke to fundamental character traits that my family had somehow never recognized. David, who had been unusually quiet throughout the morning's revelations, finally spoke up. "Sarah, I have to ask, was the Philippines operation typical of your deployments, or was this an exceptional situation?" Mike laughed, but it wasn't a humorous sound. "Sir, with respect, Lieutenant Commander Mitchell's service record shows a pattern of exceptional performance in exceptional situations. The Philippines was remarkable, but it wasn't an anomaly." He scrolled through his phone again, pulling up what appeared to be official military records. "Would you like to hear about the convoy operation in Afghanistan where she coordinated a medical evacuation while under direct enemy fire? Or the humanitarian supply mission in Iraq where she negotiated safe passage through 3 different militia territories?" My parents exchanged glances that spoke volumes. They were beginning to understand that the Philippines operation wasn't a single moment of heroism. It was representative of 8 years of service characterized by leadership, innovation, and personal courage that they had never bothered to learn about. "Mike," I said quietly, feeling slightly overwhelmed by the attention, "you don't need to catalog my entire service record." "Actually, ma'am, I think I do," he replied with the kind of determination that reminded me why Marines have such a reputation for tenacity. "Because your family deserves to know that the woman they seated at the children's table last night has spent 8 years proving that some people are willing to risk everything for others. whether those others are typhoon victims in the Philippines, wounded soldiers in Afghanistan, or displaced civilians in Iraq. As the weight of Mike's words settled over our table, I realized that this wasn't just about my family understanding my military service. It was about them recognizing that the daughter they thought had been avoiding responsibility had actually been embracing the ultimate responsibility, the willingness to put other people's lives ahead of her own safety and comfort. The emotional weight in the coffee shop had become almost palpable as my family absorbed the reality of my military service through Mike's detailed briefings and video evidence. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. My mother, who had spent 8 years treating my uniform as an embarrassment, suddenly stood up from the table with tears streaming down her face. "I need some air," she whispered, her voice breaking as she hurried toward the hotel lobby entrance. My father immediately followed, leaving Rebecca, David, Mike, and me sitting in stunned silence. Through the large windows of the coffee shop, we could see my parents on the sidewalk outside, my mother with her face in her hands, my father's arm around her shoulders as she sobbed with the kind of grief that comes from confronting a profound, personal failure. "Sarah," Rebecca said quietly, her own voice thick with emotion, "I think Mom just realized what we've done to you for 8 years." Mike, who had been sharing military stories with professional pride just moments before, now looked uncomfortable witnessing this intimate family breakdown. "Ma'am, perhaps I should give your family some privacy." "No, Mike, please stay," I interrupted. "You're part of this story now. And honestly, I think my family needs to hear everything, even if it's painful." David stood up and walked to the window, watching my parents' emotional scene unfold outside. "Sarah, I have to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." I braced myself for another difficult question about my service record or my life choices. "How many family gatherings did you attend where we made jokes about your military career? How many times did we dismiss your deployment stories or change the subject when you tried to share something meaningful about your service?" The question hit harder than I expected because it forced me to quantify the emotional damage that had accumulated over 8 years. I thought about Christmas dinners where my deployment stories were met with polite disinterest, birthday celebrations where my military accomplishments were overshadowed by discussions of Rebecca's career milestones, and family reunions where relatives asked when I was going to settle down and get a real job. David, honestly, every single time, every family gathering for 8 years. Mike's expression hardened as he began to understand the depth of my family's dismissal. "Sir, if I may," he said, addressing David with the controlled anger of a fellow service member, "what you're describing is exactly why so many military personnel struggle with civilian transitions. It's hard enough to come home from combat zones, but when your own family treats your service as a phase to outgrow rather than a calling to respect—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung heavy in the air. Military suicide rates, PTSD struggles, and the difficulty many veterans face when seeking support from family members who don't understand or value their service. Rebecca's hands were shaking as she reached for her coffee cup. "We weren't just unsupportive," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We were actively undermining everything Sarah stood for. Every time we asked when she was going to get a real job, we were telling her that 8 years of service to our country meant nothing to us." Through the window, I could see my mother had stopped crying and was now talking animatedly with my father, gesturing with the kind of intensity that suggested she was finally processing the full scope of what they had learned. Whatever conversation they were having outside was clearly as emotional and significant as the one we were having inside. "Sarah," Mike said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed too many family breakdowns within the military community. "I've seen this scenario before. Good soldiers, exceptional officers, who come home to families that don't understand or appreciate their service. Most of them eventually give up trying to bridge that gap." His words forced me to confront a truth I'd been avoiding for years. I had given up trying to bridge that gap. After years of having my stories dismissed and my accomplishments minimized, I had stopped sharing anything meaningful about my military life with my family. I had essentially written them off as people who would never understand or appreciate what I was doing. Mike's right, I admitted. I stopped trying to explain my deployments years ago. It was easier to let you all think I was just playing soldier than to keep having my actual experiences dismissed. David returned to the table, his businessman's composure completely abandoned. Sarah, we robbed ourselves of knowing our own family member, but worse than that, we robbed ourselves of being proud of someone genuinely worth being proud of, the sea. Conversation was interrupted by my parents returning from outside, their faces showing signs of the emotional storm they'd just weathered. My mother's makeup was completely gone, but her expression was clearer and more determined than I'd seen it in years. "Sarah," she said, sitting down and taking my hands in hers, "your father and I just had the most important conversation of our marriage. We need to tell you something, and we need everyone here to witness it." She paused, looking around the table at Rebecca, David, and Mike. "We've spent 8 years being ashamed of our daughter's career choice, but sitting here this morning, learning about what she's actually accomplished, watching that footage of her risking her life to save others, we realize that we're the ones who should be ashamed." My father nodded, his voice rough with emotion. "Sarah, we were so focused on what we thought success should look like that we completely missed the fact that our daughter was already more successful than we ever dreamed possible. More than that," my mother continued, her grip on my hands tightening, "we missed 8 years of being proud of someone who deserves our pride, our respect, and our support. We can't get those years back, but we want the rest of your military career, however long it lasts, to be different." Mike smiled for the first time since my parents' emotional breakdown began. "Ma'am, if I may say so, that's exactly what Lieutenant Commander Mitchell deserves from her family." As I looked around the table at these people who were finally seeing me clearly for the first time in 8 years, I realized that the wedding reception catastrophe had actually been the catalyst for something I'd never thought possible. My family finally understanding and respecting who I had chosen to become. But there was still one more revelation coming that would complete their transformation from dismissal to genuine pride, and it was bigger than anything they'd learned so far. As our family conversation reached this new level of understanding and commitment, Mike's phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen, and his expression immediately shifted to one of surprise, mixed with something that looked almost like reverence. "Excuse me," he said, standing from the table. "I need to take this call. It's significant." While Mike stepped away to answer his phone, my family and I sat in the comfortable silence that follows emotional breakthroughs. The coffee shop around us had returned to its normal Saturday morning rhythm, but our little corner remained charged with the energy of transformation and newfound understanding. Rebecca reached across the table and touched my hand. "Sarah, I have a confession to make. Last night, after we got home from the reception, David and I stayed up until 3 a.m. researching your military service online." I raised an eyebrow, curious about what they might have discovered through public records and military databases. "We found your official Navy biography," David continued. "And Sarah, there are things listed there that go way beyond what Mike told us about the Philippines operation." My father leaned forward with the intensity of someone who had discovered a treasure trove of information about a stranger, only to realize that stranger was his own daughter. "Sarah, according to the Navy's official records, you've received 13 individual awards and commendations. 13. The number shouldn't have surprised me. Military careers accumulate awards over time, but hearing it spoken aloud by my father, who had spent years dismissing my service, carried unexpected weight. But that's not what shocked us the most," Rebecca said, pulling out her phone and scrolling through what appeared to be screenshots of military websites. "Sarah, why didn't you ever tell us that you were selected for the Navy's Advanced Leadership program? Or that you were nominated for the Defense Department's Humanitarian Service Award. Before I could answer, Mike returned to the table, his face carrying an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of excitement, respect, and what looked almost like awe. "Lieutenant Commander Mitchell," he said, his voice formal again. That call was from Admiral Patricia Richardson at Pacific Fleet Command. The mention of Admiral Richardson sent a chill down my spine. She was a legend in the Navy, one of the highest-ranking women in naval history, and someone whose reputation for excellence was matched only by her reputation for not tolerating anything less than perfection. "Sir?" I said, automatically switching to formal military address. "Is there some issue with yesterday's reception? I hope my family's questions about classified operations didn't—" Mike held up his hand to stop my concerns. "Ma'am, Admiral Richardson wasn't calling about security issues. She was calling because news of last night's reception has reached Pacific Fleet Command." The confusion on my family's faces was obvious. How could a family wedding reception in Virginia have reached the attention of senior Navy leadership in Hawaii? "It seems," Mike continued, "that someone at the reception last night recorded part of my father's speech about your service in the Philippines. That video has been shared through military social media channels and has reached senior leadership." Stomach dropped. Military careers can be destroyed by viral videos, even positive ones. The thought of my personal family drama becoming a Navy-wide spectacle was terrifying. "But ma'am," Mike said, his formal tone giving way to barely contained excitement, "Admiral Richardson wasn't calling to express concern. She was calling to inform you that the Navy has been looking for an officer with your exact qualifications and experience for a very specific assignment." The coffee shop seemed to fade away as Mike's words sank in. In the military, when admirals start looking for officers with specific qualifications, it usually means something significant is about to happen. "Mike," I said carefully, "what kind of assignment?" "Ma'am, Admiral Richardson wants to offer you the position of Operations Director for the Navy's new International Humanitarian Response Command. It's a newly created position that would coordinate all Navy humanitarian operations worldwide." The silence that fell over our table was absolute. My family stared at Mike as if he'd just announced that I'd been selected for a mission to Mars. While I tried to process the magnitude of what he'd just told me, "The position," Mike continued, "would make you the Navy's senior expert on humanitarian operations, with responsibility for developing protocols, training personnel, and coordinating with international partners. It's essentially building on everything you accomplished in the Philippines, but on a global scale." My mother's voice was barely a whisper. "Sarah, are they offering to put you in charge of humanitarian operations for the entire Navy?" Before I could answer, Mike nodded. "Ma'am, the position comes with a promotion to commander and assignment to the Pentagon. Admiral Richardson said that Lieutenant Commander Mitchell's innovations during the Philippines operation have already influenced Navy doctrine, and they want her to lead the development of new humanitarian response capabilities." David, who had spent years in the corporate world, understood the significance immediately. "Sarah, they're offering you a Pentagon position based on your field innovations? That's like being recruited by corporate headquarters. Because your local solutions worked so well, they want to implement them company-wide." The irony was almost overwhelming. 24 hours ago, my family had seated me at the children's table because they thought I wasn't successful enough for adult conversation. Now, I was being offered one of the most prestigious assignments in the Navy, a position that would put me at the forefront of international humanitarian operations. "There's one more thing," Mike said, his voice carrying the weight of the most significant revelation yet. "Admiral Richardson said that if Lieutenant Commander Mitchell accepts this position, she would be the youngest officer ever appointed to lead a major Navy command function. The assignment would put her on track for promotion to captain within 3 years and potentially flag rank before age 40. My father, the businessman who had spent 8 years waiting for me to get a real job, was staring at me as if seeing me for the first time. Sarah, they're essentially offering you the chance to become a general? Admiral Dad. In the Navy, we call them admirals. As the magnitude of this opportunity settled over our table, I realized that the family wedding that had started as my greatest humiliation was ending as the catalyst for the most significant professional opportunity of my military career. The children's table had somehow led to the Pentagon. The weight of Admiral Richardson's offer hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield, transforming our family coffee meeting into something that felt more like a war council. The Pentagon assignment wasn't just a career opportunity, it was validation of everything I had sacrificed for over the past 8 years. Recognition that my unconventional path had led to exactly where the Navy needed me to be. But as I looked around the table at my family's faces, I realized that this decision would affect more than just my military career. For 8 years, I had served while feeling disconnected from the people who mattered most to me. Now, just as we were rebuilding those relationships, I was being offered an assignment that would take me even further from home, deeper into a world they were only beginning to understand. "Mike," I said carefully, "did Admiral Richardson indicate how quickly she needs an answer?" "Ma'am, she's expecting your response within 72 hours. The position needs to be filled within the next month, and there are confirmation hearings with senior Navy leadership that need to be scheduled." My mother reached across the table and took my hand, her grip surprisingly strong for someone who had been in emotional turmoil just an hour earlier. "Sarah, honey, I need to say something, and I need you to listen to me completely before you respond." The seriousness in her voice caught everyone's attention. This wasn't the uncertain woman who had been crying outside the coffee shop. This was someone who had processed the morning's revelations and reached some kind of internal resolution. "For 8 years, your father and I have been waiting for you to come home from the military and start what we thought was your real life," she said, her voice steady but thick with emotion. "We wanted you to settle down, get married, have children, build the kind of life we thought would make you happy." Rebecca and David exchanged glances, clearly understanding where this conversation was heading. "But sitting here this morning, learning about what you've actually accomplished, watching that footage of you saving lives in impossible conditions, hearing about this Pentagon assignment." Mom paused, struggling to find the right words. "Sarah, we've been trying to pull you away from your real life. The military isn't something you're doing until you figure out what you want to be. It's what you are." The admission hit harder than any criticism ever had. For years, I had felt torn between my military calling and my family's expectations, as if I had to choose between service and love. Now, my mother was essentially giving me permission to stop feeling guilty about that choice. "Ma'am," Mike interjected gently, "if I may share some perspective from someone who's watched a lot of military families navigate these decisions." My father nodded, clearly interested in Mike's professional insight. "The officers who make the biggest impact on the military and the world are the ones who fully commit to service without reservation. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell has the potential to save thousands more lives, to change how the Navy responds to humanitarian crises globally, to train the next generation of officers who will face impossible situations." He looked directly at my parents. "But that kind of impact requires total commitment. It means missing family gatherings, accepting that service comes first, and trusting that the people you love understand why you've made that choice." David, who had been quietly processing everything since Admiral Richardson's call, finally spoke up. "Sarah, I have to ask you something as someone who's built a career in the corporate world. How often do opportunities like this come along?" "David, honestly, this kind of assignment might be offered to 1 or 2 officers per generation. The chance to build an entirely new command function, to implement innovations on a global scale." I paused, trying to put the significance into civilian terms. "It's like being asked to design the blueprint for how an entire industry operates." Rebecca leaned forward, her expression intense with the kind of focus she usually reserved for major marketing campaigns. Sarah, forget about our family for a minute. Forget about what Mom and Dad want. Forget about what I think you should do. If you could design your perfect military career, would this Pentagon assignment be part of it? The question cut straight to the heart of everything I'd been avoiding. For years, I had been balancing my military ambitions against my family's expectations, trying to find some middle ground that would satisfy both. But Rebecca was asking me to consider what I actually wanted, separate from anyone else's approval or disapproval. Rebecca, if I'm being completely honest, this assignment represents everything I hoped my military career could become when I first commissioned 8 years ago. The chance to take field experience and turn it into doctrine that could save lives worldwide. To work at the strategic level where policy decisions affect thousands of people. Then take it, my father said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had finally understood something fundamental about his daughter. Sarah, take the assignment. The simplicity of his statement was stunning. After 8 years of questioning my career choices, my father was now encouraging me to pursue the most demanding assignment of my military life. Dad, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. This Pentagon position would mean even longer hours, more time away from family, deeper commitment to military service. It's the opposite of everything you've wanted for me. He smiled, and for the first time in years, it was a smile of genuine pride rather than polite tolerance. Sarah, what I wanted for you was success and happiness. I just didn't understand that you'd already found both of those things in the military. My mother nodded, tears forming in her eyes again. But these were different tears, tears of understanding rather than grief. Honey, we spent 8 years trying to bring you home from your calling. We're not going to make that mistake again, Mike smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed something remarkable. Ma'am, for what it's worth, I think Admiral Richardson chose exactly the right officer for this assignment. As I sat in that hotel coffee shop, surrounded by family members who were finally seeing me clearly for the first time in 8 years, I realized that the Pentagon assignment wasn't just a professional opportunity. It was a chance to fully embrace the path I had chosen without guilt, without reservation, and with the complete support of the people I loved most. The children's table had led not just to recognition, but to freedom. The freedom to be exactly who I was meant to be, with my family's blessing rather than their resistance. But there was still one final decision to make, and one last conversation that would determine whether this transformation in my family relationships would last beyond the emotions of a single weekend. 3 months later, I stood in the Pentagon's E-ring corridor, wearing the gold oak leaves of a Navy commander on my uniform collar. The promotion ceremony had been attended by my entire family, the same people who had once seated me at the I. Children's table now sitting in the front row of one of the military's most prestigious venues, beaming with pride that had taken 8 years to develop but would last a lifetime. But the real transformation hadn't happened in the Pentagon ceremony. It had begun that morning in a Virginia hotel coffee shop, when my family finally learned to see past their assumptions and recognize the person I had always been. The International Humanitarian Response Command was already making a difference. The protocols we had developed, based on innovations from that typhoon-ravaged night in the Philippines, had been deployed to earthquake zones in Turkey, flood regions in Bangladesh, and hurricane-devastated areas in the Caribbean. Each mission saved lives using lessons learned from a night when a young lieutenant commander had refused to accept that 200 hospital patients were expendable. My office door opened, interrupting my reflection, and Mike Hastings entered, wearing the silver leaves of a Marine major. He had been promoted and assigned as my liaison officer, continuing our partnership that had begun in Philippine storm conditions and now spanned the globe. "Commander," he said with a grin, "you have visitors." Behind him walked my entire family, Mom, Dad, Rebecca, David, and to my surprise, Tommy and Jake, now 11 and 13 respectively, and wearing matching Navy t-shirts that read, "My aunt is a Navy commander." "Sarah," Tommy called out, rushing. across my office with the enthusiasm only children possess. "Can you show us where you work? This place is huge." As I gave them a tour of the command center, explaining how we coordinated humanitarian operations across 6 time zones, I watched my family's faces transform with understanding. They weren't just seeing their daughter's workplace, they were witnessing the global impact of choices they had once dismissed as irresponsible. "Sarah," my father said quietly as we stood before a wall map showing our current operations in 4 different countries, "I owe you an apology that goes deeper than what I said in that coffee shop 3 months ago." The family gathering quieted as Dad prepared to say something that clearly carried significant weight. "For 8 years, I measured your success against the wrong standards. I thought success meant a corner office, a suburban house, and a conventional family timeline. But standing here, seeing this operation that saves lives daily, understanding that your decisions affect thousands of people." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "Sarah, you achieved success beyond anything I ever imagined possible. And I almost missed it entirely because I was too narrow-minded to recognize greatness when it was sitting at my own dinner table." My mother stepped forward, her eyes bright with tears of pride rather than regret. "Honey, do you remember what you told Tommy that night at the reception? You said being a hero isn't about wearing a uniform, it's about choosing to help others, even when it's difficult or dangerous or when nobody notices." I nodded, remembering that conversation with the 10-year-old who had shown more interest in my service than my own family had displayed in years. "Well," Mom continued, "I want you to know that we see you now. We see the hero you've been all along, the leader you've become, and the lives you've saved, and we're sorry it took us so long to notice." Rebecca approached with David beside her, their expressions carrying the weight of siblings who had finally learned to truly know each other. "Sarah, I need to tell you something that happened after the reception. David and I spent the entire next week researching military families, reading about the challenges service members face when their families don't understand their calling." She paused, pulling out her phone to show me something she'd saved. "We found stories of soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who had achieved incredible things but felt disconnected from their families because their service wasn't valued at home. And we realized that we had been part of that problem." David nodded, his lawyer's precision evident in his words. "Sarah, we learned that family support isn't just nice to have for military members. It's essential for retention, mental health, and continued service excellence. We weren't just failing you personally. We were potentially depriving the country of continued service from an exceptional officer." Their words hit harder than any military commendation ever had, because they represented understanding at the deepest level, not just of what I did, but why it mattered beyond our family dynamics. Jake, now 13 and clearly having absorbed some of his family's new perspective, spoke up with the directness that had impressed me at the reception. "Aunt Sarah, I've been reading about the Philippines operation online. There are articles about it in military magazines, and they all say the same thing. What you did changed how the Navy responds to disasters." Tommy, not to be outdone by his older brother, added his own observation. "And now you get to teach other people how to save lives like you did. That's like being a superhero teacher." As I looked around my Pentagon office at these people who had traveled from Virginia to visit me at work, I realized that the transformation that began with Colonel Hastings' recognition at a wedding reception had created something more valuable than any military assignment, a family that finally understood and supported each other completely. Mike, who had witnessed this entire journey from that first night in the Philippines through this Pentagon reunion, smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had watched a story reach its perfect conclusion. "Commander, I think it's safe to say that the children's table was exactly where you needed to be." His words carried the weight of truth that extended far beyond our family's story. Sometimes the places where we feel most dismissed or undervalued become the platforms for our greatest recognition. Sometimes the people who seem to understand us least are simply waiting for the right moment to see us clearly. And sometimes, the paths that appear to lead away from love actually lead us to deeper connections than we ever thought possible. As my family prepared to leave, heading home to Virginia with stories about the Pentagon and pictures of their daughter's command center, I realized that the moral of our story wasn't just about military service or family understanding. It was about the danger of assumptions, the power of truth, and the remarkable transformations that become possible when people are finally willing to see each other as they really are. The children's table had taught us all that heroism doesn't always announce itself, that the most important stories aren't always told in the spotlight, and that sometimes the people we think we know best are actually strangers whose true selves we've never bothered to discover. But most importantly, it taught us that it's never too late to start over, to ask the right questions, and to build relationships on the foundation of who people actually are rather than who we assume them to be. 8 years of misunderstanding had been transformed into a lifetime of genuine pride, respect, and love, all because one night, a Marine colonel decided to ask the right questions about a woman sitting at the children's table. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.